Hello and welcome. My name is Father William Maestri, and this is Overfed and Undernourished. Our topic for this presentation is Race in America, Different Voices. The overwhelming narrative that we are told today about race in America goes as follows. America is a sick and sinful society, that police are the enemy, and that white people are inherently racist by the mere fact that they are white. Now, that particular narrative, I think, is not only wrong, it's also very dangerous and really leads to a dead end in any kind of formation of what we hope is a more just, more ordered, and more peaceable society. But in the face of this kind of orthodoxy that we hear on the media day after day, hour after hour, in our elite universities and by the intellectual elites that populate them, as well as the various publishing arms of our society, and also into the popular culture itself, in the arts and entertainment, and especially in the world of sports, not to mention a kind of joining by, as you might suspect, politicians who are looking for their own advantage, as well as various private corporate entities who are trying to prove that indeed the charge of racism or being racist is simply not true. But in this overwhelming flow that we're now being told about American society and about classes and races within the society, there are a significant and important number of what we might call contravailing trends or contravailing narratives or stories. And I'd simply like to highlight two, because I think that these two individuals have been at this for many decades. But it's not just their longevity. It's also their wisdom, their insight, and their importance for helping us to move beyond the present situation in which we find ourselves. And the two individuals I'm talking about are both professors at the Hoover Institute, which is located on the campus of Stanford University in Palo Alto, California. The first is Shelby Steele. And Shelby Steele, and I'd like to recommend two of his latest books for your reading, and more than that, for your serious thinking. White Guilt, and his most recent book, which I want to quote from at the end of this presentation, is Shame: How America's Past Sins Have Polarized Our Country. And the second individual is an economist, esteemed economist, professor, Dr. Thomas Sowell, who teaches economics and is really an economic and really political philosopher, and a keen eye on these kinds of trends, and has written so many books, and all of them are worth reading and pondering, and really should find their way more and more into public policy and social policy decisions. One way to get into Dr. Sowell's important thought is, I would suggest to you, there is a Thomas Sowell Reader. It's a book of collections of excerpts and articles and columns that he has written over the period of many, many decades. And what he has to say and what he continues to say is very relevant for us today. But let's begin with Professor Steele. Shelby Steele has a very interesting thesis and analysis. And he says that what has happened is a paradigm shift, a prism shift, through which we look at the issues of race and culture in American society. He said, traditionally, we looked at it we looked at the questions of race and equality and justice in American society through the lens or through the prism of what we might call classical liberalism. And classical liberalism, it valued the individual, the dignity of each person, the importance of the rule of law, just laws, natural rights, inalienable rights, and above all, the crown was the idea of individual liberty and freedom. That was the jewel in the crown of the American experience and the American language. The ability of the individual to reach their potential, to be all they could be, and that those particular barriers, unjust barriers, that they were being removed and removed and removed, not instantaneously, not quickly, not overnight. This was not a microwave kind of job, but it was the twilight's long struggle to allow each and every person to reach their potential, and they were free because they had the opportunity, not the guarantee of an outcome, but they were free to realize their God-given potential and talents, and those avenues were open to them and should be open to them more and more, because American society has much to gain by inviting all of its citizens to contribute to the common good. But Professor Steele goes on and says that there was a change that took place. And that change really began in the 1960s. And what happened was there was a paradigm shift from classical liberalism to what he calls the new liberalism, in which freedom took a back seat to what he calls the pursuit of the good, the good. And you say, well, gee, what's wrong with pursuing the good? Well, the good came to be understood as in the hands of governmental elites and bureaucrats and academics, the good became the plan for building. They were kind of like architects, kind of social engineering, if you will, of building that kind of perfect, more just society, that perfect society that would have dismantled all of the evils of slavery, which was and is understood, and it's permanent, America's original sin, and that through social engineering, through government programs, through the ability of elites to devise ways in which people could live together in order to achieve this kind of almost heaven on earth, this kind of paradise, that this was the good that we should proceed with, and that the real cause of all of this was unjust discrimination, mainly racism. And America had finally reached the point where it confessed its original sin. It acknowledged its loss of original innocence. But it didn't have the effect that they thought. In other words, it was the principle of unintended consequences. Because what this began to spawn, if you will, or develop, was a whole victim class, an entitlement class, a grievance industry in which people came forward and demanded, even though they may not have been directly affected or responsible, they began to feel entitlements and kind of special considerations for things that happened in the past, which the present had tried down through the centuries and is trying to eliminate. But that guilt, that shame remained, and that therefore the people who were classified as the oppressed, and that could be for gender, race, sexual orientation, nationality, what have you, if you could get into that category of treating groups as being abused and discriminated against, then you could lay claim morally to all kinds of benefits that supposedly were once denied to you. And so this became a whole industry in which many politicians were only too eager, seeing votes and political power, because it came down to power, they were only too eager to embrace. And this new liberalism seeking the good, caused tremendous damage to American society and to race relations. The idea that, for example, the police are the enemy, and that that has given us what we have today is either to defund the police or, in fact, to abolish the police. Well, the communities that are most affected negatively are the very communities that most need police. Now, we're not talking about bad police. We're talking about good police with more training, more resources. But the answer for some today is, let's get rid of the police, get rid of the police, and we'll substitute social workers for the police. Now, I'm not sure that anybody who's really thinking straight for a moment would embrace that. When somebody is committing a violent crime, or crime is running rampant in a community, I'm not sure what a social worker is going to be able to do to control that. There needs to be a police force. Granted, it needs to be monitored. We need to make sure that individual rights are respected, that every person's dignity and their legal rights, their natural rights, their civil rights are respected. But the answer is not to eliminate the police. The answer, it seems, is better policing, because the very communities that are most affected by crime and by violence are the communities that most need the police. The police need not be the enemy. They need not be this bastion of terror that they're often portrayed to be. In addition to that, an amazing trend of thought is gaining traction in our society. And it goes like this: white people are born racist. It's part of their genetic makeup. They can't help it. They're not responsible for it. They didn't ask to be born white. We understand that. But by the mere fact that one is white, one is therefore a racist, loves discrimination and injustice, and it is something that one can never get rid of. One can never get rid of. Hence, one lives under shame and guilt. And too often, that is the entrance into enormous amounts of power. And you see it. You see it in the aftermath of the George Floyd case and what some people call the Ferguson effect, that police are now looked upon as the enemy. And we saw tremendous demonstrations and violence and destruction just along this particular line. And the irony of this, if not the downright contradiction, or really catch-22, is that the very people who are claiming that racism is a genetic trait of white people, I thought we had gotten rid of all of that. I thought we had gotten rid of eugenics, the idea of breeding certain qualities in and out of people. We certainly rebelled against the idea that blacks were inferior, and it was a genetic inferiority. It was something in their genetic makeup, and we railed against that, and rightfully so. Rightfully so. But yet, now we're being told that this racism is biologically and genetically transmitted from one race to the other, and there is no redemption. There's absolutely no redemption. And yet, here's the catch-22. Because whites now, especially our elites and our politicians and the chatter class, tell whites that they are indeed inherently and genetically and biologically racist, there's this mad dash, if you want, for immunity absolution, if you will, and a kind of disassociation. So we have to put out our wares to show that, and we go to great lengths to show that we are not racist. So therefore, you're in the bind of having to prove a negative. And so you see various programs and various companies and various politicians trying to outdo each other in making sure that there isn't a remote possibility that one could get a sniff that one is in the presence of a racist. And this has brought about a great deal of animosity. And it's also inherently wrong to think that somehow this is transmitted genetically. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. And to further complicate the issue, there are many who believe that the full blossoming of blacks in American society will only take place when there is this change and whites come around and are able to somehow lift blacks up by rejecting their racism, white racism. And so in effect, whites are the source of salvation for blacks. Now that's pretty demeaning and insulting. But even worse, how can whites who are genetically and biologically racist by the mere fact that they're white, how can they be the source of redemption for blacks? It simply doesn't make sense. The strength of the black communities and the black people in the United States is within their own communities themselves, within the family, within providing good school, through good school choice, through better policing, good policemen with resources and rewarding good police officers, greater community relations among the police, definitely, and eliminating bad police, people who want to see bad policemen leave or good policemen. Nobody wants them. No profession who honors itself wants bad people in its profession, because we take the broad brush and we paint them. We paint them. Honesty compels me to say, with the sex abuse scandals in the Catholic Church, with priests, it became fashionable. All priests are pedophiles. All priests abuse children. All priests are sexual predators. Granted that it was a small minority. One is too many, but a small minority. And yet all priests were painted with that brush. Very unfair. So it is by painting all policemen, or all whites as racist, all blacks as victims and powerless. This is the kind of hot rhetoric that has got us way, way far off the course of the dream that Martin Luther King Jr. had proposed. It's not the color of skin, it's the content of character. And that dream is still long denied in many, many quarters, especially in today's hot environment, where race, once again, and has always been, either below the surface or out exposed for all to see. It has always been the hot topic within this American experiment in self-government. The second person I would like to call to your attention, and again I recommend Professor Steele's two books, White Guilt and Shame, is the economist Dr. Thomas Sowell. And Dr. Sowell advances what he calls the invincible fallacy. And the invincible fallacy is where there is a disparity in representation within a given job, a given profession, within a given group, or any kind of activity. If there's a disparity in terms of the number of racial groups that are actually participating in it, and their representation in the larger society, there must be a nefarious reason for that. That is, if, for example, blacks make up 12 to 13% of the population, but they're only represented in 5, 6, 7% of those who get PhDs in science, there must be a reason, and the reason is bad. It has to be because of unjust discrimination against blacks in that particular field of endeavor, in the PhD programs and in hiring practices. Dr. Sowell shows with tremendous statistics, and not only in the United States but worldwide, that these disparities may be explained in a very sound way, other than simply that this is racial discrimination. But he calls it the invincible fallacy because people are not interested in that. Race is an easy thing to latch on to. It's an easy thing to grab and use as the only possible explanation. But what it overlooks is the factor of culture, the cultures that various groups have, the values that flow from that culture. Their ethnic groups have different cultures. We celebrate that. We honor that. We have various days and various festivals, for example. Even in religion, we have various expressions within religious celebrations that honor the contributions of various cultures that they bring with their language, their dance, their art, their learning, their own kinds of philosophies and understanding, their appreciation and ways in which they express religious belief. And I'm using that as an example, but also all kinds of ways in which various cultures contribute to the overall good of a society. So cultural values are very important. And what kind of cultural values are present within the local communities? Is it law-abiding? Is it work hard? Is it study, succeed, save? Is it being a good citizen? Is it raising a family, an intact family? Those kinds of values. What is valued in the community of which one is present? And so we have to take a careful analysis, because those values grow up over time, and they're made by individual choices, which also brings us to the idea of choices. We can say that there are not enough blacks in science and in medicine. There are not enough blacks in those various PhD programs that produce greater prestige, greater income, greater upward mobility. But those are individual choices, because blacks gravitate to PhDs in education, community service, communications, social work, etc., which are not as high paying, nor are they as visible in the society as science and medicine and all of those kinds of sciences. And yes, they do attract a disproportionate number of Asians, people from India, and from other parts of the world. They do. Not because other groups are excluded, but because other groups do not matriculate into those areas of study. Well, that's a freedom of choice. Do we now force people to go and, well, you go into medicine, but I'm not interested in medicine. I want to be a social scientist, or I would like to work in community affairs. Well, I'm sorry, we don't have enough scientists with your color or your ethnicity. That's a kind of totalitarianism that too often follows those who have a plan for socially engineering how we arrive at this new Garden of Eden, this kind of new good that Professor Steele talks about. Also, we have to look at areas of the environment. And I'm talking about the social environment and those factors. The importance of not becoming pregnant at a teenage period of one's life, getting an education, and one of the most important things is coming from an intact family, a husband, a wife, working in that kind, proceeding from that kind of family arrangement. That's one of the most important factors. And when the family is in shambles, the family as an institution and individual families, the results are devastating for children. The statistics are simply there. They're neither black nor white. That's what the statistics tell us over and over and over again. And so I think that these factors have to be taken into consideration before we begin this kind of rush to a kind of new good, a kind of new reorganization of the society, because this is in some ways driving us further and further apart. Now, that's not the narrative. It's not the narrative. It's not the orthodox narrative that we too often hear today. And that's why we need to hear the voices of people, wise and who have been working at this a long time, and they are serious adults because they really care, not only about today, but they also care about tomorrow. And I would like to end, if you'll indulge me to close, with the closing, just a couple of sentences from Dr. Steele's new book, Shame. And he writes the following, if you just bear with me. No nation has struggled harder to overcome the barriers to our common humanity or to sanctify the individual than America. The contortions of our hyperbolic politics can be depressing, but America's essential truth, the deepest theme of our identity, is still freedom. Freedom is still our mother tongue.